Good evening, everyone, distinguished speakers, our guests and attendees to this important webinar. Thank you all for coming and participating and taking part in this important webinar that has been organized by the Law for Palestine in collaboration with the Independent Commission for Human Rights in Palestine, as well as the Community Action Center in Al-Quds University. My name is Munir Nusayba. I'm a professor of international law at Al-Quds University, and I am also a member of the board of trustees at Law for Palestine. This evening's webinar will focus on the recent developments that have taken place in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip over the past year. We'll look at the methods that have been used to examine and to resist, legally speaking, the crimes that have taken place and that are still ongoing. Will shed light on the current developments that are ongoing right now, including, for example, the attacks against the UNRWA, a UN institution that provides aid to the Palestinian refugees in Palestine and in other areas as well. This webinar will focus on this. I will say a couple of words in Arabic to welcome our guests in Arabic, and then I will turn back to English, which is the language of the current webinar. السلام عليكم جميعا، أهلا وسهلا الأعزاء المتابعون باللغة العربية. هذه الندوة سوف تكون باللغة الإنجليزية أساسا. هنالك ترجمة فورية إلى اللغة العربية. يمكنكم الاستماع للترجمة باللغة العربية من خلال النقر على الأيقونة على شكل الكرة الأرضية أسفل شاشة الزوم واختيار اللغة العربية. في فقرة الأسئلة والتعليقات يمكنكم طرح الأسئلة تعليقاتكم باللغة العربية، وسوف يقوم المترجمون بترجمتها. للمتابعين عبر يوتيوب سوف تستمعون للندوة فقط بالإنجليزية. سوف يتوفر التسجيل للندوة مع الترجمة الفورية باللغة العربية على موقع منظمة القانون من أجل فلسطين مع نهاية الأسبوع. شكرا. Now I will turn back to English. This webinar will be in English, but there is a translation from Arabic to English and vice versa. I would like first, before start learning from the experiences of our distinguished panelists, to thank the members of the Jurists for Palestine Forum, as well as our friends who are attending this webinar via Zoom, and those who are watching us on the live broadcast on YouTube. And of course, I would like to thank the organizers of this webinar, Law for Palestine, the Al-Quds University Community Action Center, as well as the Independent Commission for Human Rights. Now I will turn to start to listen to, to start learning from the experiences of our distinguished panelists. Our first panelist will be Dr. Ammar Dwaik, who is the director of the Independent Commission for Human Rights in Palestine. Dr. Ammar and all of our panelists each will have 8 to 10 minutes to speak. We want to keep maybe some 20-30 minutes for questions and discussions at the end of the webinar. So for our friends who would like to participate, to ask questions or anything else, please feel free to do so by using the Q&A or the chat, or also you are welcome to raise your hand if you want to speak, but this will be after we hear and we listen to all of our to the presentations of all of our panelists. So, Dr. Ammar, please.
Thank you, Munir. Thank you, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Ramadan Mubarak. I will start to talk about the situation, how they look like on the ground from Palestine. Since October 7th, the Israelis have moved from managing the conflict to a phase of trying to end the conflict. Of course, ending the conflict on Israeli terms. And for doing so, they are waging an out-all war against Palestinians. And this war is unrestricted, unchecked. The use of force against civilian targets. There is no restraint for this force. And the result, we see it in Gaza, and now it's unfolding in the West Bank. The situation in Gaza, we have a very fragile ceasefire, which might collapse at any time, meaning that we will go back to the resumption of genocide and the war. Even if the war does not resume, which we hope for, the humanitarian conditions in Gaza are catastrophic. The destruction that had been inflicted in Gaza makes it unlivable. And it seems that the Israelis are using the humanitarian aid as a weapon to continue to pressure the community in Gaza by not allowing the aid as agreed upon with Hamas in the so-called humanitarian protocol. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza will most likely continue and persist and will be an open humanitarian catastrophe. Trump statements on February 5th about the moving out Gazans and taking over Gaza by the Americans, rebuilding it, although it seems impractical, but the danger of such statements is that it returned back very strongly the discourse of displacing Palestinians. Now, among Israeli elites, popular discourse, political discourse, talking about displacing Palestinians, transfer is a mainstream talk. Trump's statements were welcomed and praised by Israeli politicians, including politicians from what is classified as the center, political center in Israel, which shows the level of dehumanization of Palestinians that the Israeli discourse has adopted so far, that looks at Palestinians as a problem, and the problem can be solved through ethnic cleansing. The situation in the West Bank is also in a situation that not precedented since 1967 in terms of destruction. At least 40,000 Palestinians have been forcefully evacuated from 3 refugee camps in the north, in Jenin, Tulkarem, and Al-Far'a, near Nablus. This is the first time that such an operation happens in the West Bank since 1967. The 40,000 displaced persons are among the poorest in the Palestinian community. Refugee camps are historically marginalized, excluded, and the residents of these camps are the most vulnerable communities in the West Bank, and they are now displaced. The humanitarian response to their displacement by both the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA is inadequate because both the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA face severe financial crisis because of the Israeli restrictions. The Israelis, they withhold the majority of the Palestinian taxes. The PA is at the brink of bankruptcy. And UNRWA is facing a legal and political and operational constraint, which makes its work very, very difficult, particularly in the West Bank and, of course, in Jerusalem. Under such circumstances, the question is how Palestinians can be protected. in the face of such a war, an open-ended war by the Israelis. What happened in the last 15 months in Gaza shows that the international humanitarian law does not provide protection. Protection mechanism is very weak, inefficient. Accountability system is very weak, if it does exist. And yet, these weak mechanisms in the international humanitarian law, in the protection and accountability, these very mechanisms are under attack now by the American administration, which shows that the future is very bleak for Palestinians, and the worst is yet to come. We have a declared war on the Palestinians, supported by an American administration that does not believe in multilateralism or international law or in the ICC. So what can be done to protect Palestinians? I believe now the main actor that can and should play a role in providing protection to Palestinians is Arab countries, Arab states. The only good thing about Trump's statement about Gazans and the displacement of Gaza, the ethnic cleansing of Gazans, is that it returned the case of Palestinians back to its Arab framework. Now it's not a Palestinian problem anymore, it's an Arab problem. And Arab countries who, for the last 15 months, played very little role in providing any protection to Palestinians, now they face the problem. It returned back to them with Trump's scheme and statements. I think Arab states, particularly countries that have mutual relation with Israel, they have some leverage over the Israelis by threatening to cut relations, cut economic or political ties. Arab countries also are required to provide safety net, political and financial and legal safety net to UNRWA, so it can continue to function. Otherwise, the situation will continue to deteriorate, and the Israeli scheme, quote unquote, the voluntary immigration will become a reality, because conditions on the ground will continue to deteriorate. Palestinians will have no protection. Life conditions are unbearable in Gaza, and slowly it's becoming so in the West Bank. So Palestinians will have no option. Therefore, Arab countries, in order to avoid another Nakba and another mass migration to their countries, they need to act, and to act now to prevent such a catastrophe from happening. I'll stop here, and I'm sure my colleagues will have very interesting points to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ammar. We turn now to Professor Susan Akram, who will focus on the implications of the ban of the UNRWA, which Israel has recently officially enacted and also starting to practice. Professor Susan Akram is a director of the International Human Rights Clinic at Boston University School of Law. She teaches, lectures, and publishes in the areas of immigration, refugee, and international human rights law. She is the recipient of 2 Fulbright Senior Scholar Awards to Palestine, teaching at Al-Quds University between 1999 and 2000, and Spain, and lecturing and working on refugee resettlement with the Human Rights Clinic at the University of Murcia between 2021 and 2022. Please, Professor Akram.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I'm going to talk about banning UNRWA and the criminalization of the agency, the impact of the laws, Israeli laws, on UNRWA's mandate, consequences to Palestinian rights, and I will try to end briefly on the related advisory opinion request that's pending at the ICJ, and I will do my best to do that in 10 minutes, but you may need to stop me if I go on. Israel has for a long time taken measures to impede and dismantle UNRWA operations. It has accused the agency of anti-Semitism and inciting terror through its educational curricula, and in various ways increasingly restricted its work. After the October 7 Hamas attacks, Israel stepped up its efforts to terminate UNRWA, discredit its work, and cease its donor funding. It accused 12 UNRWA staff members of participating in the October 7th attacks, but failed to provide evidence to support its claims. UNRWA's suspension of the employees who were accused of participation and its report indicating insufficient evidence of involvement did not protect UNRWA from losing funding of major donor states. In October of 2024, Israel passed legislation declaring UNRWA a terrorist organization and abolishing UNRWA's legal status in the occupied territory. Israel's motives in eliminating UNRWA have long been clear. It perceives UNRWA as the agency and the symbol to preserve Palestinian fundamental rights to return and obtain restitution of their properties, as demanded by General Assembly Resolution 194. If UNRWA is eliminated, in Israel's view, so are Palestinian rights and any mechanism to enforce them. So Israel's passing of 2 laws to stop the activities of UNRWA in the occupied territory have grave consequences, both in legal and human terms. The first law bans UNRWA from operating within Israeli territory. The second law ends Israel's 1967 Colmay-Michaelmore Agreement, which required Israel to establish its offices in Jerusalem and operate throughout the occupied territory. They also declare UNRWA, as I mentioned, a terrorist organization. There are 2 aspects to consider: the consequences of ceasing UNRWA funding and its recognition on Palestinian refugees' survival, and the consequences of those events on Palestinian refugee status. As to the first, Israeli closure of UNRWA operations in the occupied territory will most drastically affect the survival of the 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza, for whom UNRWA is the single most important agency, providing essential humanitarian assistance, food, shelter, medical care, water, and other survival needs. It will also curtail vital services to over 700,000 Palestinians registered with UNRWA in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, as well as affect the lives of over 1 million non-registered Palestinian refugees there. Even beyond the occupied territory, shutting down UNRWA's headquarters in Jerusalem and ceasing or depleting its funding has a huge impact on all the other UNRWA fields in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Decreased funding from donor states has an impact on all the areas of operation, affecting all 6 million refugees across the 5 fields. UNRWA is, of course, the main provider of health, care, education, essential services, microfinance, and other relief and social services. Over 600,000 children receive education in UNRWA schools. Just in Gaza alone, before the latest conflict, UNRWA's 288 schools provided education to 300,000 children, and its 22 medical clinics documented about 3 million patient visits per year. Of course, now the need is exponentially more acute, with over 100,000 Gazans injured and all suffering from the massive death and destruction, the denial of most of the services, and an acute humanitarian crisis. All of this is aside from the fact that UNRWA employs 30,000 individuals across all its fields, most of them Palestinian. As to the second consequence, cessation of UNRWA funding and withdrawal of recognition by Israel and a few other states, that has no impact on the status of Palestinians as refugees. UNRWA was established in 1949 by General Assembly Resolution 3024 to carry out relief and works programs for Palestine refugees. It has both the humanitarian and development mandate to provide assistance and certain aspects of protection to Palestinian refugees, pending a just and lasting solution to their plight. Palestine refugees falling under UNRWA's registration criteria and those eligible for registration remain Palestinian refugees as a legal matter, regardless of what any single country or group of states determine as far as funding or recognition is concerned. The status of Palestinians as refugees derives from a series of General Assembly resolutions and customary international law, and it would require a UN General Assembly action to change their legal status. Neither Israel nor any other country can withdraw Palestinian refugee status, as that is an international matter independent of the actions of individual states. Moreover, if UNRWA's operations are terminated entirely in the occupied territory, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees will be obligated to step in to provide humanitarian assistance and international protection to Palestinian refugees. Under international humanitarian law, since Israel is an occupier, UNRWA's termination would trigger its obligation to provide for all the needs of the occupied population. It is quite clear that Israel has not thought through these consequences, as it clearly has no intention of providing for the needs of Palestinians in the absence of UNRWA. The international community is thus left to ensure the fallback to UNHCR, which has the broader mandate of international protection in addition to humanitarian assistance. So what would the termination of UNRWA's operations mean for Palestinians' refugees' right to return? Their right to return, like their international legal status, is enshrined in UN resolutions and rests on 4 separate bodies of international law. The General Assembly's first resolution about the Palestinian refugees, General Assembly Resolution 194 of December 1948, determined the rights of Palestine refugees and established the UN Conciliation Commission on Palestine, the UNCCP, to implement those rights. In its paragraph 11, Resolution 194 incorporated the international law of return, restitution, and compensation, and the obligation of the UNCCP to enforce them for all Palestinians meeting the definition of Palestine nationals, a definition broader than just the status of refugee. Resolution 194's principles on the rights of Palestinians, particularly the twin rights of return and property restitution, were grounded on international humanitarian law, human rights law, and the law of state succession, all of which are found in customary and treaty law and apply universally to all displaced persons and refugees. Termination of UNRWA's services has no impact on these rights, although the ability of the UN to implement these rights will be more difficult in the absence of UNRWA. So how does the refugee status granted by UNRWA differ from what might be expected by UNHCR? UNRWA does not grant refugee status. Its registration system does not grant a status, but recognizes individuals as meeting the definition of Palestine refugee as defined in 1952. This is a needs-based definition, indicating that the individual is eligible for humanitarian assistance and social services. It is not a status definition as such, and does not entitle a registered refugee to international legal status for purposes of a durable solution. The legal definition of Palestine refugees in terms of international protection, in contrast, is under the mandate of UNCCP, the agency established to guarantee and implement Palestinian legal rights and their durable solution, led by the right of return. The UN separated Palestinian refugees from other refugees by establishing separate agencies, on the one hand for legal protection, that is the UNCCP, and on the other hand, humanitarian assistance, that is the mandate of UNRWA. UNHCR has no authority to provide protection to Palestinians within UNRWA's 5 fields, but can do so outside of UNRWA areas, and it is questionable whether the interpretation of the relationship between UNRWA and UNHCR will now allow the mandate of UNHCR to extend within what was traditionally an UNRWA area, that is the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. At the same time, UNRWA and UNHCR do not have parallel mandates, as UNHCR has a clear obligation to access and implement durable solutions, while UNRWA has no such mandate. Turning briefly to the legality of Israel's law regarding UNRWA. First, the points of law regarding Israel's actions vis-à-vis UNRWA. Israel's legislation, as part of its broader attack on UNRWA, its facilities and personnel, violate the UN Charter and international law. As a UN member state, Israel is obliged to support and respect the privileges and immunities of all UN bodies, including UNRWA. A few particular points to note on this. UN Charter Article 104 provides that the UN, in all its functions, must enjoy in each member state the legal capacity necessary to exercise its functions and fulfill its purposes. Article 105 of the UN Charter provides that the UN shall enjoy in each member state's territory the privileges and immunities necessary for fulfillment of its purposes. Israel is also a party to the Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the UN of 1946. That treaty, among other provisions, commits states parties to guarantee that the UN, its property and assets, shall enjoy immunity from every form of legal process. It requires that the premises of the UN shall be inviolable. It prohibits member states from searching, confiscating, expropriating, or in any other way interfering with the property and assets of the UN. It requires member states to provide all members or organs of the UN immunity from legal process of any kind. Israel is also a party to the Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the Specialized Agencies, which mirrors the obligations of the UN Convention on Privileges and Immunities and extends them to all specialized UN agencies, which include UNRWA. The parallel provisions in both treaties are rather obviously violated by Israel's actions. Since UNRWA is a UN organ, it cannot be eliminated by the actions of any one or group of countries, but requires the collective decision of the General Assembly itself. Israel's actions in undermining, impeding, and declaring a UN body a terrorist organization violates its positive obligations to support and promote the work of UN organs and protect their facilities and personnel. In fact, declaring a UN body a terrorist organization has no precedence since the establishment of the United Nations. How are these actions, finally, likely to be viewed in the pending ICJ advisory opinion? The pending General Assembly request for an advisory opinion submitted on December 20th, 2024 to the ICJ asks, in essence, what are the obligations of Israel as an occupying power and as a member of the United Nations in relation to the activities and presence of the UN, its agencies and bodies, as far as the obligations to provide the means of survival of the Palestinian population and their right to self-determination. Israel is, from an international law perspective, and is now reaffirmed by both advisory opinions from the ICJ on the wall and occupation, only entitled to sovereignty within the 1948 borders of Israel, excluding the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. The July 2024 advisory opinion on the occupation has, for the first time, declared the entire occupation illegal, not just Israeli measures within the occupied territory. This means that any Israeli legislation, including its new laws on declaring UNRWA a terrorist organization and shutting down its offices in Jerusalem, are outside of its legal authority. To be consistent with its two prior opinions, the pending ICJ opinion will definitely reaffirm that. Related to Palestinian self-determination, the other major issue the current advisory opinion question covers, The consequences of terminating UNRWA will be examined in this regard. Terminating UNRWA affects all four aspects of self-determination that the July advisory opinion on the occupation addressed: territorial integrity, population integrity, affected through displacement, discrimination, and fragmentation, sovereignty over resources, and determination of political status, including pursuit of economic, social, and cultural life. Israel's shutting down UNRWA's headquarters in Jerusalem has a huge impact on its services and the rights and livelihood of Palestinians throughout the OPT and in the other UNRWA fields. As an unlawful occupier, any Israeli legislation affecting Palestinian rights, resources, and more broadly, their self-governance is unlawful. UNRWA is, of course, the primary organization providing and coordinating humanitarian assistance, shelter, medical care, and more in Gaza. Since UNRWA's headquarters in Jerusalem are its base for services in all the occupied territory, this has particularly dire consequences for Gaza, as well as all of the rest of the areas where Palestinians are refugees. The advisory opinion question does not explicitly raise this, but the ICJ should address all aspects of the Israeli laws affecting UNRWA. Israel's designation of UNRWA as a terrorist organization has major implications for all of UNRWA's staff, as it gives Israel the justification to target and arrest or kill any UNRWA staff member, not just in the OPT, but anywhere. Israel has had complete impunity in extrajudicial assassinations of those it designates as terrorists, including assassinations in Iran, Syria, and Lebanon. Even without this designation, Israel has killed over 170 UNRWA personnel in Gaza and damaged or destroyed over 160 UNRWA facilities there. Israel is declaring UNRWA a terrorist organization.
Susan, if you can please...
A few more minutes, yes, thank you.
Conclude, please. Thank you.
It has consequences for other states in terms of ongoing funding decisions. If they decide this is a designation they must take into consideration. So I will leave what challenges could be made to Israel's actions for the Q&A, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Akram. We turn to Professor John Quigley, who will discuss the legal dimensions of protection measures. Professor Quigley is a professor of law at the Moritz College of Law, Ohio State University. Please, Professor Quigley, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Munir. And I appreciate the invitation to me, and I appreciate the remarks of the two previous speakers, Dr. Ammar and Professor Akram. And they have set out some very important elements of the situation that we are addressing here. Certainly, Dr. Ammar made the case for a need for protection for the people of both the Gaza Strip and of the West Bank. Or should I say, I just heard yesterday that within the U.S. Congress, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee has instructed his staff not to use the term West Bank of the Jordan River anymore, but to use the terms Judea and Samaria. But I will stay with the term West Bank. There is a good international precedent for protection for populations in conflict situations. And that has been implemented previously by the United Nations, and it could be implemented here as well. It was implemented, in fact, in 1956 when a United Nations force called the United Nations Emergency Force was established by the General Assembly in order to function on the frontier between Gaza and Israel. So there is precedent for a protection force in Gaza that was set up after Israel, along with Britain and France, attacked into Egypt and into Gaza in 1956. And with the resolution of that situation and the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, a force was established which maintained itself for a full decade on that frontier. Now, this precedent also comes with a certain caution because in 1967, after President Nasser of Egypt withdrew the consent of Egypt to having that force stationed in Gaza, there was a partial withdrawal, but that withdrawal had not been completed as of the time that Israel then attacked on the 5th of June into Gaza. And when the Israeli forces went into Gaza, they attacked the headquarters of the United Nations Emergency Force. And they killed a number of personnel of the emergency force, some 15 members from India and 1 member from Brazil, and they wounded another larger number in the course of doing that. So the Israeli army just went right through the protection force, killing as they went, and they were not at all deterred by that protection force. So one has to keep in mind the danger of putting in place a force that does not have either the diplomatic or the military protection to sustain itself. In the year 2001, the United States Army conducted a study, you might call it a hypothetical study, of what a United States protection force would look like in Gaza and the West Bank. This was a very detailed effort that was done by the Army at a military base in the United States. And they set out a detailed plan for the protection of the Palestinians. At the time, they were looking forward to the potential establishment on the ground of a real Palestinian state, and that this would be part of that operation. But in their plans, and this is all recorded in documents one can find on the internet, in their plans, they gave a warning about the Israeli armed forces and the danger that the Israeli armed forces would not cooperate with a protection force. And they said, and I'm quoting now from the plan, they said, well, they characterized the Israeli armed forces as the 500-pound gorilla in the situation, that is a danger. they went on to say that the Israeli armed forces are, and now I'm quoting again, are well armed and trained. They operate in both Gaza and the West Bank, and they are known to disregard international law to accomplish their mission. This is the year 2001. This is the United States Army giving its assessment of the Israeli armed forces and saying that they disregard international law to accomplish their mission. That was 25 years before the current situation in Gaza. So that is the main caution. All of this goes back legally to a resolution that the General Assembly adopted in 1950 in connection with the hostilities in Korea, resolution number 377 of 1950, in which the General Assembly said that when the Security Council is unable to act because of a veto in a situation of armed conflict, that the General Assembly can step in and make recommendation to the membership of the UN to organize action outside of the Security Council. And that was, in fact, the basis for the UN action in Korea that went on for several years. I mean, not just protection, but actual, engaging in military action against an opposition force. So that was the precedent that was then used in 1956 by the General Assembly to establish the UN emergency force. So there is plenty of international precedent. There is also the possibility that the Security Council could engage in such action, of course, under Chapter 7 of the Charter. That is unlikely because of the U.S. role in the Security Council, but that was used by the Security Council in 1993 in the Balkans to set up a force that would protect the town of Srebrenica in Bosnia during the hostilities that were ongoing at that time. And such a force was set up. Unfortunately, it was not done very well. It was not done in a way that the UN force could protect even itself from attack by what at the time were called the Bosnian Serb militias. And the Bosnian Serb militias went in despite the presence of the UN force and killed a very large number of Bosnians. So the history of these protection forces is unfortunately not something that one can look at with a great deal of optimism. But if it were organized properly, and we've just heard suggestions here from Dr. Munir that the Arab forces and Dr. Ammar has said that the Arab countries could step in, given the position now being taken by the United States. If it were set up by them, it might be able to be set up in such a way that it would have enough diplomatic protection that the Israelis would respect it. Now, Professor Akram brought up the situation of the refugees in right of return. And it seems to me that as long as we are thinking big here, one should also think of that situation. In particular, in light of the fact that President Trump is saying that there should be an evacuation of Gazans from the Gaza Strip. Instead of objecting to that plan, it seems to me that we might embrace that plan and say, yes, the population of Gaza, at least a good part of the population of Gaza, should be evacuated from the Gaza Strip in accordance with Resolution 194 that was mentioned by Professor Akram. They should all go back into the areas of Palestine, into their foyer, le foyer. If you read Resolution 194 in its French version, they should go back to their homes. They should be reinstalled. If you read Resolution 194 in its French version, you see where the English uses the term resettlement, the French uses the term réinstallation, reinstallation. So when the Israeli lawyers say, Resolution 194 says resettlement, they should be resettled in Iraq or somewhere else. Look at it in French. You can't reinstall those people anywhere other than in their home areas. So that's another function conceivably that a protection force could deal with and could facilitate some repatriation. I don't want to go into the details of it, but I think we should be thinking along those lines. I think I should probably stop at that point, and we can go into the other speakers and then Q&A.
Thank you very much, Professor Quigley. I should announce before introducing our next panelist that unfortunately Dr. Francesca Albanese has had an urgent matter and had to apologize, so she will not be joining us this evening. But thanks to all of those who are with us, and we will continue with our webinar. Our next speaker is Dr. Mel Duncan, who is the founding director of Nonviolent Peace Force. He is currently working in the West Bank with a group called Unarmed Civilian Protection in Palestine to bring experienced unarmed civilian protectors to the OPT, as well as enhance the protective presence work currently being done there. Mel will discuss the dimensions and feasibility of protection measures, particularly the concept of unarmed civilian protectors. Please, Mel, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Munir, and thank you, everyone. First, let me tell you a little bit about unarmed civilian protection, which is an effective but still underutilized resource. Unarmed civilian protection is also known in some areas as accompaniment or a protective presence. It refers to a series of field-tested and effective unarmed methods that have been used to protect civilians in a variety of areas around the world. We know currently that it's being used by at least 61 civil society organizations in 24 areas of violent conflict. These areas include Indonesia, the Mindanao region of the Philippines, Myanmar, Iraq, Ukraine, South Sudan, Burundi, Guatemala, Colombia, Mexico, and the United States. And when I say 61 organizations that we know of, we know that because Selkirk College in Canada is keeping a database, but there's many other organizations that are doing this that we don't know of. And that's because while the threshold of participation requires training and discipline and courage, It doesn't require a lot of money. It doesn't require a lot of equipment. And so people can participate and take part in this practice. It has been recognized by both the UN Security Council in resolutions relating, for example, to South Sudan, and also in a number of General Assembly resolutions. There is a number of precedents that I think are applicable here in the occupied territories. For example, as just was mentioned, the refugees' right of return. Unarmed civilian protectors accompanied the refugees returning from Mexico to Guatemala in the early 1990s, and they were returning from a genocide. And they were accompanied by unarmed civilian protectors. In working here in the West Bank, we've identified that there are at least 22 civil society organizations that are providing unarmed civilian protection right now. Now, of those 22, there are 6 that are international, including the Ecumenical Accompaniment Project for Palestine and Israel that's sponsored by the World Council of Churches. There's the Jewish Center for Nonviolence that presently has 2 teams in Masafer Yatta. There's the Community Protection Team that has a team in Hebron. There's the International Solidarity Movement and others. There's also, and this is very interesting, local groups that are primarily made up of Israelis providing protection for Palestinians. That includes Rabbis for Human Rights. That includes Combatants for Peace that has both Palestinians and Israelis. Looking Occupation in the Eye, Standing Together, which provided protection for those humanitarian shipments last summer when they were being attacked by settlers. What these groups all have in common are that they're nonviolent, that they only work at the invitation of local communities. The relationship is civil society to civil society, that they work based on the primacy of the local actor, that it is local people who are saying what needs to be done for their own protection, and that they work on a principle of solidarity. Last summer, we did a feasibility study looking at what needed to be done in terms of unarmed civilian protection here in the West Bank. And the 2 major recommendations that the feasibility study team found in their assessment was, number 1, to increase the number of well-trained, experienced unarmed civilian protectors. We have hundreds of people right now in the world from, I know of at least 35 different countries who have experience working in violent conflict, who could be deployed if given contextual and cultural training, but could be deployed rather quickly. Secondly, the second recommendation was to work to enhance the work of the groups that are presently doing the work. Unfortunately, because of resources, they often have to rely upon volunteers. They have to rely often on ad hoc kind of structures. And what they were asking for is additional training, a platform where they could reflect and coordinate and build trust among one another, something that we'll be providing right after Ramadan. And they also requested assistance in supporting their members in dealing with trauma. Now, presently, we are organizing to try to bring as many veteran unarmed civilian protectors here. We've built a roster that has 88 people who have signed up and are ready to come. The training curriculum is done. We need to raise the money, which we are in the process of, and to start or continue bringing people here. As we've been talking to people throughout the West Bank, and what we're seeing here is really, and it's been referenced by some of the other speakers right now, is the Gazification of the West Bank. Just yesterday, Khaled al-Daba in Masafir Yatta was attacked and by the Israeli military, and tents that had been built because homes had been destroyed 2 weeks ago were destroyed by the military. Last week in al-Khair, a home was destroyed as that particular village is right next to a settlement, and the home was destroyed to facilitate the planting of an olive orchard from the settlement, because they are the settlement is instituting corporate farming. So what we heard and what we continue to hear is get as many internationals here as soon as possible. Now, we're not saying this is the only solution, but this is an accessible tool that can be used in getting well-trained people here as soon as possible who can stay in the villages. And if I could just leave you with one thing, while people talk about the protection that that provides, and that protection honestly has eroded since October 7th. It still is there, but it's less than it used to be. But also people talk about the solidarity of people saying we don't feel alone. It breaks the isolation of apartheid when other people are with us. And that is valuable when people are committed to staying on the land. And so if I could do one bold thing, and that is there is a GoFundMe site that has been established for the village of al-Khair, that was that the army destroyed homes there and people are struggling to stay in. I'll put that GoFundMe site in the chat. People need support to stay on the land. And so please support that village today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mel. And last but not least, I introduce Varsha Gandikota, who is the General Coordinator for Progressive International, and she is the acting chair of the Hague Group for Palestine. She will focus in her intervention on the creation of the Hague Group on Palestine and the next steps that this group will take. This has been a very significant initiative introduced recently in the face of all the attacks against international justice. So, please go ahead, and I look forward to learning from you.
Thank you very much, Munir, for that introduction. And thank you, Mel, for your remarks. My apologies for coming on late. I really hate being one of those speakers that comes on just for their speech and isn't there for the full conference. But unfortunately, I'm in travel right now and in Dakar in Senegal. And I've come out of the meeting to be able to make this intervention. So my apologies for not being there for the full conference, but thank you again for having me. Okay, so the Hague Group for as introduced was launched on 31st January 2025, so just about a month ago, with 8 countries in a tri-continental bloc. So Malaysia from Asia, South Africa, Senegal, and Namibia from Africa, and Bolivia, Cuba, Honduras, Colombia from Latin America, and the Caribbean, all coming together in what I would call a historic move of coordinated collective state action. So the goal was extremely simple, which is let us coordinate measures across legal, military, and economic levers in order to curtail Israel's violations of international law. So in the last month, I've been asked this question a lot about why was the Hague Group formed? And I've found that I have a funny answer to that, which is it should not have been formed. If our existing legal architecture, whether in terms of our international legal institutions and our courts, or our multilateral systems in terms of the United Nations and its various bodies, or our national governments and the accountability of states' legal obligations under the UN Charter, all worked the way that we intended them to work, we would not be in the situation that we are in here today, which is well over 500 days of the genocide. And I will, of course, I'm sure others have said this before me, continue to maintain that the genocide has not stopped. If anything, it has only been relocated, as I'm sure many speakers before me have said already, from Gaza to the West Bank now, which in fact has even lesser ability to withstand the level of pressure and attack and assault that's coming from the Israeli machinery. So our goal when we brought together these nations was very simple. It's not to undermine multilateralism, it's not to undermine international law, but to say in the face of what we thought was sacred and what we thought was obvious, which are states' obligations to uphold international law, being brazenly defied. And we've seen this in the case not just of the United States, which is of course not abandoned international law now, as some are claiming, on the 6th of February with its sanctions against the ICC, but well before that. If anything, now it's taking a giant sledgehammer through the institutional networks, but it's abandoned international law well before that. But also the brazen defiance from European nations, from countries like France, who have spent the last many decades preaching the values of norms and Western values and referring to the rules-based just order, who are now making up rules as we go, as we've seen with the ICC warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant, and refusing to comply with them. And of course, this applies to other countries like Austria and Hungary and Switzerland and Poland, so on and so forth, members and non-members of the Rome Statute who have openly defied or challenged the ICC orders. So this group looks at three critical rulings and three critical moments. Legally, I'm not a lawyer, but we do look at international law and the principles within the UN Charter as the core basis upon which states can act. And so we look at the provisional measures issued by the ICJ in South Africa's historic case against Genocide Convention case against Israel. We look at the ICJ advisory opinion of July 2024, which of course deems Israeli occupation blatantly unlawful and lists states' obligations under that opinion on what states must do to ensure the end of Israeli occupation. And then we look at the September 2024 resolution, which brings this advisory opinion into the halls of the UN General Assembly and is voted on and sponsored by a number of countries and voted on in favor by over 124 countries, an overwhelming majority when it passes, that lays out the breadth of measures from accountability by persecution at national and international levels, to divestment, to stopping of all imports and exports of arms, to stopping and seizing settlement activities, all the way to sanctions, the full breadth of measures that are required to truly end the Israeli occupation. So the Hague group that's forms with essentially between these two phenomena, right? The phenomenon where we have these legal rulings and we have orders that has been issued that lay out our obligations and lay out very clearly what international law says. And at the same time, on the other hand, we see the phenomenon where states are openly and brazenly defying it and destroying institutions. So the Hague groups come together to say, we will, in a coordinated fashion, enforce measures at the national level to stop the genocide in Gaza, to uphold Palestinians' inalienable right to self-determination, and stop Israel's violations of international law. So how does it do that? With three inaugural measures. The first is a simple reaffirmation that in the case of members of the Rome Statutes, these 8 states will comply with their obligations with the court. And in the case of non-state parties, still refer to the ICJ state obligations of ensuring accountability for those that are listed as war criminals under the Genocide Convention and under international law by persecution on domestic soils. The second is no harbor for genocide. So not allowing preventing the use of ports on any of our lands of the nations within the Hague Group for transfer of jet fuel or military supplies to Israel. And the third is a prevention of exports, a stopping of all exports, and any transfer of arms and military equipment, again, to Israel to be used against the Palestinian people. So these are the three inaugural commitments that the Hague Group of Nations made on the 31st of January. And as we look now to expand the group, we have three priorities, right? The first is, of course, accountability. In no way did we ever want the Hague Group to be yet another talk shop, yet another group of nations that stand together and say, yes, we stand for Palestine, but without turning that rhetoric into concrete, which is why it begins with a very specific set of measures that we are now seeing being discussed and turned into state policy at each of the cabinets and each of the level of governments in every one of these countries. The second, and in a way, by bringing this conversation from within the halls of the UN into the public sphere and making a political statement out of it, I would almost argue that they're not just risking their neck in the face of sanctions and punishment from the United States, which of course are surely coming and have already begun to come for countries like Colombia and South Africa, where Trump is engaged in a serious battle with both governments, and of course in the case of Cuba, which has forever been under assault. So not only is it brave because they're risking sanctions, but it's also brave in a different way, I would argue, where they are in a way opening themselves up for public audit by taking what otherwise could be seen as diplomatic signing or diplomatic measures in the UN, which people pay lesser attention to, and bringing them out into the political sphere and making them state policy. The second is expansion in terms of the members themselves. One thing I should clarify is we've been asked many questions. I've been asked many questions about the absence of certain countries, whether from the Arab world, whether from Europe, whether from other parts of the world in this inaugural group. Our hope, and quite strategically from the beginning, was to start with a small group of champions, and especially champion countries that don't have a direct geopolitical stake, that don't have a direct national security stake. For all of the countries that I've mentioned here now, the question of Palestine is not a border question for them. It's not a security question for them. And still, you see that they've stuck their necks out and risked punishment, essentially, from the mighty countries in order to stand up for what they believe is just simply put, their obligation under international law. And we believe that that was an important statement to make. But in this next round, we've already received quite a lot of interest from countries that I'm unfortunately not at liberty to share in this call, but I can say candidly that the list is long and that it comes from all quarters of the globe. And we certainly do believe that the bloc will increase. And in fact, the bloc must increase because it's the only way, the only antidote to unilateral punishments from the United States is for the bloc to be big. Because when there's 45 countries, 50 countries, 60 countries on the side of the Hague Group, and if the United States chooses to punish each of them, it will end up isolating itself in reverse, not the countries taking these measures. So I think that's quite encouraging. And the third, I will say, is of course on the expansion of measures themselves. I know that our Palestinian comrades right now have been stressing the priority of humanitarian aid and access and medical access and questions around UNRWA's existence and their flexibility to operate, for example, as key issues. And of course, the broader breadth of measures around sanctions that are truly required to break the material arteries of the genocidal machine. And so we do hope that the group will continue to enforce and implement measures well beyond these three inaugural, which we only see as the start, not as the limit or the end of what is possible with the Hague Group. I want to close, but maybe one thing I'll add, which I wouldn't do in a more public forum, because in an odd way, I have to take off my kind of more radical or activist hat and speak. I'm not a diplomat or a lawyer, but I do find myself having to do this because we're trying to ensure that the group does not get dismissed as a radical group or a far left group, but really as a group that's just about the law, or dismissed as a global South group that European nations cannot join. But I do believe there's something incredibly powerful about a group of global South countries coming together to take on, to really subvert, I would say, institutions like the ICC, with whom we have not an easy relationship, which, as many of you know here, has for many years, candidly in our circles, been referred to as the black man's court, because that's who they brought to be persecuted very often. So I think there is something quite subversive about the global global South legal subaltern, so to speak, that has come here to use these very institutions against Israel and against its powerful backers in the United States and Europe. So I'll stop there, but thank you so much for having me and for all of the work that you do, Munir, and of course all of my esteemed speakers on this call and in the attendance.
Thank you very much, Varsha, and I really do hope that this is the beginning of a movement, and not only a group, a movement that will include as many countries as possible, because at the end of the day, it's not only about Palestine. Yes, it is, but it's not only about Palestine. It's about the justice system itself in the world that is being attacked by powerful countries currently, like the US, sanctioning an international court. Israel seems to be going to that direction as well, and who knows who else will be going to that direction. This is, it's not only violating international law, but starting to attack the international institutions is really, it's really unfortunate, and it needs a very strong stance from countries around the world. Now we have 15 more minutes actually for the Q&A. And I was asked to keep the time, so I will start by reading a couple of questions for maybe two of our distinguished speakers to answer, and then maybe another questions, but also for the distinguished attendees. We've had a very good attendance today of over, around 150 attendees in this webinar. So feel free to ask more questions. I hope to have the opportunity to answer. That we'll have the opportunity to answer them, and if we cannot, please forgive us. I'll start with this one. This one of the questions says, since Israel is a lengthy and historic violator and has a steady record of violating international law and the UN Charter, is it time basically to reconsider Israel's membership, to restrict it, to suspend it, or to permanently annul it? This is one of the questions by an anonymous person asking it. And another question is about the historic precedent on the protection force, especially since it was attacked by Israel. How can the latter be sanctioned to enforce the will of the majority of the UN member states and result in compliance in spite of the inevitable US veto that might ensure the UN Security Council? So regarding the question on membership, maybe Professor Quigley or Susan, yes?
Yeah, maybe I can take the first one and Professor Quigley take the second.
Yes.
I mean, Article 6 of the UN Charter provides that a member of the United Nations which has persistently violated the Charter's principles may be expelled from the organization by the General Assembly. But unfortunately, the article says upon recommendation of the Security Council. Still, the General Assembly could resolve to withdraw Israel's membership. And that would be a major step and reinforce the July advisory opinion about, because Israel has not complied with the advisory opinion for withdrawal from the occupied territory, this would be a logical step for the General Assembly to both resolve to expel it, but also a move signaling other states to terminate diplomatic relations with Israel. It can be done.
Thank you, Susan. John?
Yes, could you repeat the second question?
Yes, of course. The second question was about, one second. Yes, the second question was about basically if the US is not going to allow sanctions to pass through the General Assembly, what else can be done in the UN in order to sanction Israel for these violations?
Yes. Well, I think that the General Assembly can act on its own under the Resolution 377 that I mentioned earlier. The General Assembly can also, as Professor Akram has just indicated, take action under Article 6. Article 6, as she indicates, does say that this should be done by the General Assembly upon recommendation of the Security Council. If you look into the history of the term upon recommendation of the Security Council in the formative documents of the UN, it does not necessarily mean that a recommendation has to be in a particular direction. That is, it may mean only that the General Assembly needs to get a recommendation from the Security Council, but could then proceed regardless of what the recommendation is, whether it's yes, or no. So I think there are some things that can be done outside the Security Council. The Hague group, about which we have just heard, to my mind, could perhaps coordinate activity with the Arab countries, with the Arab League perhaps, to set up a protection force or to take other appropriate action.
Thank you very much, John. Okay, I will, before I give the floor to Ali Sha'ar, who has raised his hand here, I will, or maybe if Ali, you can start with your question, and then I'll read another couple of questions, and then we can take them together. Please go ahead. I don't know how to do that myself. If our friends hosting the event can give the opportunity to speak to Ali Sha'ar. Can you please unmute yourself? Mr. Sha'ar? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Okay. I have two issues. I am coordinating an international conference on reality of child rights in times of crisis, and I was wondering if it is possible to invite some of the distinguished speakers. This will be end of April. The second question is if any of the distinguished speakers could allude a little bit on the violation of child rights conventions, if they have seen or observed this in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will, regarding the invitation, I'm sure you can also communicate either directly with the speakers or with Law for Palestine, who can help you get in touch with whoever you want to invite for the event. And the other question is clear and noted. Okay, let me just have a look at the questions. Okay, there is a question also about the UNRWA. What alternative can be there? And I think this is to Susan, right? What alternative can be there to the UNRWA if it is totally banned from working in Palestine, whether through the UN or also other international organizations, etc.? How can this gap be filled to provide services to the Palestine refugees? So this is another question. And then there is a question that I would like to give to Ammar to answer. How can we as students or international law activists best help the efforts to ensure Palestinian self-determination? So it's a student speaking. I go to demonstrations, I boycott, I engage in debates online, especially on biased news articles, adding info or context. What else is best? So if you're Ammar, you can answer this question, please. I'll stop here and then I'll go for more questions for our distinguished guests. Let's start with the child right question. Maybe Ammar also, no? Because you are documenting violations.
Well,
So
thank you,
Ammar,
Munir. Sorry, I have a problem with the camera, so I'll respond without opening my camera. Concerning reports on violations against children, there are plenty of reports that I would refer Dr. Sha'ab to, including UNESCO report, Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Defense for the Children, DCI, Palestine branch. They have reports that covers all these violations and war crimes and crimes against humanity that targeted children over the course of the genocide in Gaza and also what is happening in the West Bank. Concerning the role of students, I would like first to say that as a Palestinian living in the West Bank, I see that what students are doing around the world is something very great that we in Palestine gives us a glimpse of hope in humanity. We see the viciousness and criminality of governments around the world, but students send us a beacon of hope that the future will be much better for Palestinians. I would urge you to continue to do what you are doing right now, which is very great. You need, I don't know in which country you live, but I think the movement in the street should translate into political decisions and positions by the government. So you need to continue to pressure governments wherever you are. So these governments should take action in accordance with international law, with the ICJ advisory opinion, with the UN General Assembly resolution in last September 2024, which lists a list of issues that states should do to end occupation. The ICJ and the General Assembly both said that it's a collective responsibility for all states around the world to end occupation. It's not a Palestinian-Israeli issue. It's an erga omnes. It's an issue that is obliged for all countries to take action to end occupation, including sanctions, including not providing any assistance to the occupation. So I would urge you to focus on pressuring the governments wherever you live to take their action as they are obliged under international law. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you also answer the question about child rights violations?
I mentioned that I referred Sha'ar to reports. There's no time, I believe, to address.
Okay.
Because, this war was mainly against children. The
Yes.
genocide in Gaza, the main target of the genocide was children. And there are so many reports that covers the different aspects of this crime. So I would refer him to the reports. I don't think the panel have the time to answer this question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Susan, the UNRWA question.
Yes, so as I mentioned, under the regime that was established, the disparate mandates for each of the three agencies, UNCCP, UNRWA, and UNHCR. Under the interpretations of the relationship between those mandates now, especially a series of decisions out of the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, the interpretation, the prevailing consensus interpretation now is that if UNRWA services cease for any reason, then automatically UNHCR takes over the protection role for Palestinian refugees. And we have several decisions from the European Court on this, interpreting the provisions of the UNHCR statute, the 1951 Refugee Convention, and Article 1 of the Convention on Stateless People. So legally, what should happen once UNRWA's services are no longer is that UNHCR should fill in the gap. Now, you know, we know that that's going to be a very complicated proposition from Israel's point of view, but at least in Gaza, where there is an opportunity now to fill the role of UNRWA, UNHCR should be stepping in, and the General Assembly should be making that clear, passing a resolution saying that UNHCR must fill the gap. For now, as a practical matter, a whole host of other non-governmental organizations and some UN agencies are trying to do whatever they can do in Gaza, like UNRWA, like World Food Program, like the World Health Organization. They do not collectively have the organizational ability and the institutional ability to fully substitute for UNRWA because of how long UNRWA has been operating and how sophisticated its operations have been. But these are the two pieces right now that are filling and supposed to fill the gap. We will see what happens with UNHCR. The debate has not begun on that question.
Thank you very much, Susan. Okay, now I will read 3 more questions. And then I would like to ask each of you to say, you know, a concluding note, including if you want to answer a question. One of these questions is, would it be possible to call for responsibility to protect? It has different form, and what do you think could be explored? Another question by Hayat Tawil. She says, thank you. It was useful and valuable seminar. I am Hayat Tawil, a political science student at Hebron University. You spoke about stopping it and cutting. You spoke at length about UNRWA and about stopping it and cutting off its funding. This is a clear violation of human rights. What will be done regarding the issue of refugees now? And is it possible for the Palestinian refugees to join the 1951 Refugee Convention? Then there was a question by Julie Schneider, who asked, would it be possible to call for the responsibility to protect? I already actually have asked this question. So with this, I would like to ask each of you to, to speak for 1 minute. I'll start with John because I know that he is very much in a hurry, and then I will ask the other distinguished panelists to, to also take a minute. Please, John.
Yes, I would just call attention to a briefing paper that was published yesterday by the Al-Haq organization about a meeting that will be held shortly of the states parties to the Geneva Conventions. That is another forum that is separate from the Security Council. The United States has no veto, a forum where these matters can be brought up. And the states parties to the Geneva Conventions have an obligation to ensure that that set of conventions is implemented whenever you have an armed conflict. So I think that would be a very good forum in which, the Arab League, the Hague Group, others could raise these issues. But thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And in case you leave us before we close, officially, I would like to really extend my appreciation and gratitude for your contribution in this webinar, but also in all of your contribution to justice throughout your work and scholarship. Thank you. I turn to Mel.
Well, thank you. What I would say is that all the legal procedures that are going on, I think, are important. I'm not in a position to comment any more than that. But we do have a resource here on the ground that needs help, that has been shown to protect civilians now. And so we need that help. And secondly, I would caution people to not be seduced by a default position that military intervention is always the most effective intervention. Meeting violence with violence, as John already said, in the war game that was carried out by the US military in 2001, will invoke more violence. We need to find ways that will bring down the violence here. And so I urge people to be creative and look at nonviolent approaches to dealing with the conflict.
Thank you very much, Mel. Susan?
Yes, I think we are really at a critical juncture, both in terms of the possibility that international law provides any form of hope for justice, and at the same time, this enormous ambiguity about the rights and status of Palestinians, both as a national population and as refugees. And I think the more conversations with solidarity organizations and the Palestinian, not the leadership per se, but for example, the brilliant people at the Palestine delegation at the UN, and to be able to come up with a proposal that the General Assembly can pick up to fill in the gap and manifest a real solid form of protection for Palestinians, both as refugees and as nationals of Palestine. And that is the urgency of the moment, and the movement yet has not come up with this kind of consensus proposal that could be taken up at the General Assembly.
Thank you very much, Susan. Ammar?
Well, I think first I would like really to thank all panelists. Very interesting interventions. And I think all these important talks needs to be printed out in a document. On the ground, I can say that horizon is closing for Palestinians with this new Trump administration. And all what we need to do is to push back, to continue to push back against all these conspiracies and attempts to liquidate the Palestinian cause. Whether through the calls for ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza, or the annexation of the West Bank, or the liquidation of UNRWA, all these affect the very basics of the Palestinian-Israeli problem. The only good thing that we can talk about is that Palestinians are still on their land. We are still there and will continue to be there, despite the fact that the conditions will become very harsh for us. We understand. I think Palestinians are psychologically now prepared for the worst. But they understand that there's no way for them to go to. The only place for them to go to is to stay in their country. And I believe at the end, justice will prevail with the support of honest and sincere people around the world like yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ammar, and many thanks to all of you, Mel, Susan, John, Varsha. It has been really, I have learned a lot from your experiences. It has been a very good and educating webinar, and also encouraging, especially that you have, on the one hand, examined the terrible situation and the attacks against justice, but also you have focused on some of the positive events happening, the struggle for justice, the protection measures and initiatives, whether by states or also by individuals. I think this is very important. It keeps up the hope for everyone that this is not going to last. And I do have confidence that this injustice will not last. You and many others, whether those who are attending us or many others are struggling against this injustice, and it will end sooner or later. So we've gone 10 minutes beyond the time. I would like at the end to thank Law for Palestine, the members of the Jurists for Palestine Forum, the translators also, Asim El-Ayyan and Noor Haqqi, for the great work that you have done. Thank you very much for the co-organizers of this webinar. It has been really an honor to be among all of you today. Thank you very much and have a good evening, and Ramadan Mubarak to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Munir and Law for Palestine.